So, continuing with our discussion on inheritance, reusability using inheritance. Today we'll see some more aspects of inheritance and some more behavior of constructors with respect to inheritance. If you see this diagram carefully, okay, it explains you how the inheritance works. Look at this example, this diagram. It shows you that class A is the derived class, is the base class, in which you have the protected section and the public section, and class B is the derived class, in which you have say only public section, and there is an object of class B. Now the access mechanism works like this, that from the object you will have access to the public section of the class B, because the object is the object of class B, and then from here you will have access to the base class properties which are public and which are protected. You can't access the private section directly. Object will possess property C and also property A and property B. Object will possess property C and property A and property B. It will also be able to access data 1 through the public section of the base class. I have shown you the access hierarchy yesterday. This is the access hierarchy. Okay. Now, let us jump straight to our example, which we did in our previous session. Let me open this again for you, in which we have the headers. We had declared only iostream.h, that's all. We had declared a class in which we had the base class containing the private and the protected and the public section, and the derived class containing the private and the public section. In both the base class and the derived class, we had a zero argument constructor. In main function we did nothing but just created an object. That's all, nothing else. Okay, and we had no functions as of now. We wrote only one function that was about constructors, base class constructors. There was a base class constructor which just prints the base class name and the zero argument constructor, and then we had a derived class constructor that also prints just the constructor name and the zero argument constructor statement. That's all. Did not do anything special in here. I am going to change the architecture of this class a bit. Okay. We will add some data to it. Okay. Oh, we already have data. Now we'll add a two argument constructor in the base class, which will initialize the base protected data and base private data. So we'll add two argument constructor here, and we'll add a one argument constructor to the derived class, which will initialize this single private section data. So let's add the constructor here, which will be a single one argument constructor, integer. We have to just keep the prototype here, and we'll have a two argument constructor here, two integers, an integer and another integer. Now we'll do R&D on this. We declared an object here of the base class, of the derived class, which was a zero argument constructor, which was a zero argument object, we'll declare another object. This is derived class object 1. This is derived class object 2. When we declare derived class object 2, we give it a value. Say we give it a value 11. So a one argument constructor of the derived class should execute, isn't it? Let's have a look at what executes and how it executes. So let's go to derived class constructors. Constructors we'll keep in one class as of now. Actually these constructors should also go in different classes. So here is a single argument constructor, int argument a. This argument a will be initialized to the private data called data private, derived class private data, DPRI. Will be initialized with a. Is it written like this only? Is this syntax okay? Or the brackets are other way? DPRI is equal to a. Formal argument assigned to private data. Will not use initializers list here for reason. This is one argument constructor of the derived class. Okay. Let's write a one argument constructor of the base class also at the same time. Base class two argument constructor, in fact, int a and int b. So the one argument constructor, two argument constructor in the base class, which will be initialized to base private and base protected. Base private is equal to a and base protected data is equal to b. The formal arguments are getting assigned to the private members. Now, try to understand what happened yesterday. When we wrote a constructor, then you noticed that the base class constructor executed first yesterday, and then the derived class constructor executed. We saw this in the previous session. Okay, yes, the two argument constructor is in the base class constructor as specified. Okay, two argument constructor. Now what we have learned from our previous session is that the base class constructor runs first and then the derived class constructor runs, isn't it? Now let us see, when we have some values here that has to be initialized, then what happens? Let's write the clean label here. We'll remove all the object files and we will remove INHPRO inheritance program. Make clean. Okay. Now make. So there we are. Okay, we have bugs in declaration constructor. No declaration matches DRVCLS, derived class constructor. no matching. In the base class also there is problem, the constructors are not matching. In the base class intent, derived class int. You have to go to the other directory. Okay, make. There it is. Everything is absolutely fine, and we have our program compiled. Let's run it. Okay, the base class constructor runs, zero argument constructor runs first. The reason is we had created a zero argument object and then a one argument object. So the zero argument derived class constructor also runs. Then again zero argument constructor runs for the base class, but a one argument constructor runs for the derived class. Now there were no arguments supplied to the base class, so therefore zero argument constructor of the base class executed. But there was one argument supplied to the derived class, therefore the derived class constructor got executed, and that was the one argument constructor for the derived class got executed. How will you pass arguments? Now we have learned automatic. That we have learned that the base class constructor executes automatically, but we can't pass arguments to the base class constructor automatically. We have to learn how to pass arguments to the base class constructor. Okay. From here, suppose we pass three arguments. This was passing only one argument. Now suppose we have to pass another argument and another argument. We pass three arguments to the derived class object. Okay. Now, but the derived class object is only one argument object, which collects A. It will also collect B, it will also collect C, because it is a three argument object. Out of the three arguments A and B and C, A is being assigned to the private data member of the derived class. What about B and C? Well, using the initializer list, you call base class constructor and pass B and C as arguments. Let's see what happens here. This is some kind of R&D will do that. Okay, name of the base class constructor is base CLS. Let's try this. Let's see if it works. We are learning by experiments. Again, I clean, build. Oh, now let us read the errors and try to interpret errors. This will happen with you very frequently. In main, no matching function for called derived class constructor. Derived class constructor int. 3 argument constructors are required. So therefore you can't have a single argument constructor here, because you have converted this single argument constructor into 3 argument constructor. Rebuild. Oh, there it works. And let's see how it executes. So base class 0 argument constructor, okay. A derived class 0 argument constructor, okay. Now the base class 2 argument constructor got executed, and the derived class 1 argument constructor got executed. This was right way of invoking the base class constructor, and this was the right way of passing arguments from the derived class constructor, which got 3 arguments. Out of these 3 arguments, it used one of the 3 arguments, and other 2 arguments it passed to the base class constructor, and the control went to the base class constructor. And the base class constructor was here like this. The base class constructor captured B and C into its A and B and used it. I hope it is clear to everybody. Okay, I'll just comment this line so that we could concentrate only on object with arguments. There is a 2 argument constructor of the base class executed first, then the 1 argument constructor of the derived class executed. So this program demonstrates the usage of constructors. Okay. If you will have any doubts, you will ask me now before I proceed further into inheritance. Okay. Let's have a look at another example. Look at this program. It has a class called counter. Okay. In this counter class, I have the protected member. Okay. No, wait, I'll not go into programs as of now. I'll not like to confuse you guys. Instead, I'll try to go in a different way. Now I'll add some functions here. I had a function, base class public function, and a derived class public function, but we have not written these functions, isn't it? Let's write these functions now. Base class public function. We'll call these functions. Okay. Derived class object 2 dot derived class public function. We'll call this function derived class public function is called from main. Now let's write this function. Derived class public function dot cpp. So int derived class public function. This function will display the public data. The public data was in the derived class data private section. Data private section is data of private section. We'll simply display it, that's it. Then we'll write a similar function for the base class also. Data base class public function.cpp. Base class public function. In the base class public function, we will display the base class private data. Protected data. Base class protected data, which was initialized by the constructors. Okay. But we did not call the base class public function. We only called the derived class public function. Okay. Now we have to do some changes in the make file also. We have to add base class public function.cpp and derived class public function.cpp. No, .o. These will be object files. Base class public function. Base class public function. Base class public function. I hope it is clear to everyone what we are doing is. Then the derived class public functions. Derived class public functions also done. Let's make. Okay, there it is. Well, there is some derived class private was not declared in this scope. Derived class protected was not declared in this scope, and the errors are coming from base class public function. Yeah, first we have to give the return value. and the issue was that we have to resolve the scope of this function to a class. Derived CLS. This function belongs to a class called Derived CLS derived class. Scope is resolved. This function belongs to base class scope resolution. Scope is resolved now. We'll try this program again. Make clean and make. This time the compilation is still not successful. Okay, let's have a look. Base class functions. Base public function. Base public function. So we are trying to print dpri and dpro. It is bpri, dpro. This will be b. This will be base class data. Now make it successful and let's try to run it. There it is. So the 2 argument constructor runs and the 1 argument constructor runs and the main begin and end. Why didn't the main call another function? Because we have modified the main in another directory, wrong directory. Okay. Clean again, build again, and run again. There you see the derived class public section, the derived class public function got invoked and it displayed its own respective data because it was called from main function. The control went to the function, but then it didn't call the base class function. You have to display the base class data also, isn't it? So to display the base class data also, you will write this in this derived class function like this. Now once you have displayed the data of the derived class, then you have to display the data of the base class also, because the derived class have inherited the properties of the base class. So the derived class should be little responsible also about invoking the base class functions. Now the derived class public function is in the public section of the derived class. Okay, it is in the public section of the derived class. From the public section of the derived class, you can access the public section of the base class, isn't it? So let's do it. From the public section of the derived class, we'll invoke a function which is the base class public function will be invoked. We have to resolve the scope also. Base class. Like this, from here you can call the base class function. Okay. Now the base class public function will be invoked. I'll just have a look at the base class public function. The base class public function is here. It is displaying the private and the protected sections. I will just display the protected section first, because you see from the derived class private section, see this carefully, from the derived class public section, if you don't understand, ask me. The derived class public section, you can access base class public section. Then from here, can you access the private section or this section? Protected you can access, but I did not show any arrow towards private section. Did you notice that? So I am commenting the private data to be printed right now and trying to execute it. Let us see first, are we able to reach the base class public section function from the derived class public section function? Let's try this. Make clean build. Build is not successful. There is some syntax error. Derived class public function. I missed a semicolon. Let's try again. Make clean, make, and run. So I am able to call after the constructors main begin, derived class public function executes, and then the base class public section also executes and is invoked successfully. See, from one class you are calling the function of another class. From the derived class function public section function, you are calling the base class public section function. Now here it is for the first time that you invoked a public section function of a class without using object of the same class. Earlier you have learned that the public section function is always executed as check.public section function. But here there is a twist in that. The base class function was executed from the derived class function, which was further invoked through the object. So we have the derived class object dot derived class public section function. From definition of that derived class public section function, you invoked the base class public section function. Isn't it? So it all happened like this. From the object of the derived class, we had another diagram. From the object of the derived class, okay, we invoked a function in the public section of the derived class, and from the function inside the public section of the derived class, we invoked another function of the public section of the base class, and which accessed the protected data also. So this access was successful, isn't it? Now let's try the private data, see what happens. We will try to access the private data also. Let's see. Make clean, make, run. Well, you are able to access the base class private data also. Okay, so the data of the base class is compromised when you have a derived class. So why it happened? Why you were able to access the base class private data directly? Okay, because the hierarchy of classes goes like this. To understand this, let us create another diagram. Okay. Suppose this is your derived class, base class, sorry, first base class. Base class in which you have the private, section, the protected section, from the public section. See this carefully, okay? This is the base class. Now inside the class, you always have this hierarchy. From the public section, you can access the protected section. And from the public section, you can also access the private section, as always, isn't it? Now let's have a derived class. Now inside the derived class also, hierarchy is as usual. You can always access the private section from the public section. And when you created the object of the derived class, then the object, through the object you can always access only and only the public section. Object, you can access the public section. Now, okay, this is the class relationship, class and the object relationship. Now when I modify it and try to access from the public section of the derived class, we try to access some function inside the public section of the base class. And because the derivation is public, this access is successful. If somehow from here you are able to reach here from public of this to public of this, then look at these blue lines. It is always taking you to the private section, because you are accessing the private section fine, but you are accessing the private section from the public section of the same class. Therefore this access was valid. The private section of the base class is not at all compromised. In fact, the private section of the base class is being accessed from the public section of the base class only, and that is the class hierarchy. It always works like that. So it's absolutely fine. I hope you understand my point. Why data was not compromised? Why the data access was absolutely valid. Okay. There is one more thing that I want to discuss here in continuity. Yeah. Just have a look at these functions. Let's go to main, and main calls the derived class public function. Okay, here we are in derived class public function. From the derived class public function, we were calling base class public function earlier, isn't it? We would not do it like this time. Let's comment it. Why did we call base class public function earlier? We called the base class public function from the derived class public function earlier because from the base class public function we wanted to access the protected and the private data of the same class. Okay. This time we'll not call base class public function from derived class public function, but we will try to access from the derived class public function. We will directly try to access the protected data of the base class without calling the base class function. So we are testing this link now. From the derived class public function, straight away try to access the base class protected data and print it. The base class protected data will be printed. We have to resolve the scope. Base CLS scope resolved to base class protected data. Now we are going to print the base class protected data by resolving the scope of this variable to the base class. Let us see if we are able to access this or not. I hope everybody is able to understand what I am trying to do here. Let's test it. Make clean, make, well, no compilation errors, run. See, the base class protected data is being printed from the derived class public function. So from the derived class public function you have direct access to the base class protected data. Got that? Let's go a step further now. Let's try to print base class private data from derived class public function. Okay. Make. Well. Compiler has a problem here. Read what it says. The base class BPRI is a private within the context of the class. Okay. It is saying that the BPRI is declared private here. It cannot be accessed from the public functions of other classes even if they are inherited. But the private data could be accessed from the public section of its own class, public function of its own class, but not the public functions of other classes. Okay. I hope you are able to understand the concept that I want to deliver to you. Now, to consolidate on this, what you have to do is understand this diagram, try every blue lines, try to access the protected data from public of this derive, try to access private of base from public of derive. Third, try to access the public function of base from public function of derive and access protected, then access private. So these 4 checks has to be done. Okay. I have tried to explain this to you through other diagrams, and you go through the video tutorial once again. So that's all I got for you today. If you have any queries, you can put in the comments and ask me queries. I'll be able to resolve that in the discussion forum.